Our devotion today is from 1 Peter 4, beginning with verse 12 and looking at the second half of that chapter. And in today's passage, again, Peter is dealing with the topic of persecution and of suffering. Before we look at it, remember today to be in prayer for George and Kathy Brufman. So I think one of the main messages that I got from this passage is that not all suffering is created equal. Peter's talking about mainly suffering in this passage, and he talks about two different types of suffering. The first type of suffering that he talks about is the kind that we bring on ourselves by the dumb things that we do. He talks about suffering as an evildoer, suffering as a thief, as a murderer, as a busybody who is in other people's business. I love that he adds that one in here because it's one of the things that maybe sometimes we think as a lesser sin, and yet he includes it in with these other ones, and we absolutely, each one of us, can identify with that type of suffering. We've all done dumb things. We've all been disobedient to what we knew we should be doing, what we knew would be pleasing to God, and we've brought suffering on ourselves. It could just be the natural consequences of what we've done. Things that we knew were going to happen, but we did them anyways because we wanted to satisfy our own flesh in the moment. It could be the judgment of God in the here and now, where God just convicts our hearts. And we know what Peter is talking about when he talks about that kind of suffering. He says, as a follower of Christ, we don't want to suffer that way. The second type of suffering that he talks about, which he's already spoken about in an earlier chapter, is suffering for good, for being a follower of Christ. This seems really to be a reoccurring theme that Peter brings up here. Do you think maybe it's because the church he was writing to was suffering? I think absolutely. They were facing persecution because they were followers of Christ. And he starts out in this passage and he says, don't be surprised by what's happening to you, by the fiery ordeal that you're going through. You already know that this is what's going to happen to followers of Christ. It's Christ said it himself. And it makes me realize, I think, maybe even in those days, there was that idea for them that we have today, that if I'm a good person, if I'm a good follower of Christ, if I do what God wants me to do, then God's going to take care of me, right? And everything's going to be okay. And maybe he'll even bless me and give me some of the things that I want so I can be happy and satisfy my flesh. But I think, obviously, that's not the message of the New Testament. The message is that we're not at home where we're at. We're not to be in love with this world, and we're not to live comfortable lives. We are to stand up for Christ and be passionate about it and expect that we're going to suffer, because the world is not going to put up with that. We're not going to fit nice and neat into place here in the world. I think one of the other things that stood out to me is when he talks about that kind of suffering in this passage, he talks about it in the perspective of eternity for them. And he says, not only are you blessed when you experience this kind of suffering, but you're waiting for the glory of Christ to be revealed, and you're worshiping him and you are glorifying him in your suffering. And he finishes up the chapter reminding them about the coming judgment. And he mentions two judgments here. He says the judgment for the followers of Christ and the judgment for the unbelievers, the ones who are doing the persecuting. And he makes it very clear, obviously, in this, that there are two separate judgments, that there is a judgment for the followers of Christ, those who've been saved, but it's obviously they're still saved. It's not a judgment based on their salvation. But he talks about the hopeless destination of the unbelievers. And I think just having that perspective changes a lot. It should change a lot for us, knowing that we're going to face judgment for what we've done, not for our salvation, but for our works as followers of Christ, it should cause us to want to live daily, purposing in our heart to live a life that's pleasing to Christ and in obedience. But also, when we face persecution, we have that eternal perspective. We know that this isn't the end, and we know the destruction that our persecutors are headed for, and that should cause us to have a heart of compassion for them, to want to see them, even override whatever feelings of hate we might have for them and disdain. We want to see them come to know Christ. That's what this passage spoke to me today. If God spoke something to you out of this passage, leave us a message and let's minister to one another. God